Closed captioning for Lakeland Currents is supported by the Minnesota Department of Commerce, Telecommunications Access Minnesota, and Nisswa Tax Service. Nisswa Tax Service, tax preparation for businesses and individuals. Across from City Hall in Nisswa and online at nisswatax.com.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Lakeland Currents, where tonight we talk about your electric bills, my electric bills. What are they going to cost in the future? And we have experts with us this evening who have just recently come back from Washington, and I think they can give us some very good information, and maybe we'll even be a little confused when we're all through because it is such a complicated issue. Before we do this, we're going to look at a piece that Annie Cook has done recently about a business here in Brainerd that has developed a way to store energy from wind and solar sources. So let's look at that piece before I introduce our guests.
This is Silent Power, a company right here in the Brainerd Lakes area that's quietly making a name for itself in the energy world.
It's taken a while to get here, but fairly rapid acceleration through the rest of the year.
The 7-year-old company just put out its first product, which converts DC energy into AC power. But later this year, Silent Power plans to release its third creation.
That's a device that would basically store renewable energy and then actually release it onto the electrical grid during peak consumption times.
What this company of 16 employees is embarking on is cutting-edge technology that would help alleviate some of the storage concerns pertaining to renewable energy. Silent Power has played host to some big-name visitors, such as Senator Amy Klobuchar and Governor Tim Pawlenty, both politicians visiting, knowing companies like Silent Power will be the way of the future.
We're really trying to take renewable energy and really make it more usable, for the nation as a whole.
Silent Power's continued growth and that of other companies dealing in renewables is due in part to government action to promote green technology.
In general, we see the trend behind renewables as very positive and something that will help our company.
Governor Pawlenty's 25 by 25 plan requires utility groups to generate 25% of their electricity from renewable sources by 2025. If these levels aren't met, there will be financial penalties. While this is a controversial proposal, forcing the transition to green energy may be the only way the country can become energy independent. For Lakeland News at 10, I'm Annie Cook.
My guests this evening are from the Minnesota Rural Electric Association, and they represent 44 different co-ops, and they represent some things other than that too. I'm going to let them talk about that in just a moment. But I'd like to introduce, first of all, Norm Krause, who is the president of the Minnesota Rural Electric Association. He's also a member of the Todd Wadena Electric Co-op, which is how he probably got into this business to start with. And Mark Glace is the general manager and the chief executive officer of the organization. He's also a registered lobbyist in Washington, D.C., and I know both of you have been out there just very recently. Maybe we could start with you, Norm, and maybe you could tell us what you do as president of the Rural Electric Association.
The Minnesota Rural Electric Association is a trade association that represents, as you said, 44 electric distribution co-ops and also 6 generation and transmission co-ops in Minnesota. And we actually provide power to about 1.7 million people in the state of Minnesota. My role is as chairman of the board. It's a 14-member board comprised of 2 directors from each of 7 districts. From our smallest co-op, which is about 2,500 members, to our largest co-op, which is 110,000 members near Minneapolis.
And how did you get your job? It's not that I want it. I'm just curious how you got it.
It's a democratic process in that we're elected to serve on our local distribution co-op, and then through the trade association, we are elected to serve from each of the 7 districts in Minnesota. It's a 3-year term, and annually then the board reorganizes, and from there they select the slate of officers to govern the board of directors.
And Mark is the general manager of the organization and its chief executive officer. What is it that you do?
I manage the day-to-day affairs of the electric cooperatives, visit with the 44 co-ops on a regular basis. Earlier today I was at Lake Region Electric talking to them about legislative issues both at the state and federal level. State level, we're involved in a number of issues. At the federal level, we just got back from Washington, D.C. to talk about rail issues, principally the lack of antitrust oversight on the rail industry, which, according to the Consumer Federation of America, has added $300 to the cost of each Minnesota family. 4 railroads control 93% of the nation's traffic, no antitrust, and they can charge whatever rates they want. So we're involved in a lot of legislative issues. Beside that, we educate the line workers on job training and safety. We also do a fair amount of education for the directors who are lay people. This is a very complex business that they've been elected to, the honor of being elected to represent the members they serve. So it's a variety of issues: education, legislative representation, and training for line workers, along with legal representation, regulatory representation.
When you say the railroads are adding $300 per family, is that over what period of time?
That would be annually.
Annually?
Annually. It depends. Some of the G&Ts, including XL, have seen rate increases 93%.
What G&Ts means?
Dairyland Power Cooperatives, generation transmission cooperative owned by the distribution systems. And so they have had to raise rates because of what Burlington Northern can charge on a take it or leave it basis. You can't truck in coal, you have to rail it in. And so if you look at the demographics of the co-op Norm talked about, we serve the rural poor. The per capita income of the average co-op consumer is 20% below the state average. And the railroads are are charging rapacious rates, which have an enormous economic impact on our members. And so Senator Klobuchar has been the lead in the United States Senate to put them under antitrust. And that was one of the issues that we addressed earlier this week.
What is it costing the average cooperative member per kilowatt for electricity right now?
Right now in the state of Minnesota, we're close to 10 cents per kilowatt hour. We serve only about 4 to 5 members per mile of line, if I remember that right. So our cost to serve each member is much higher than, say, a investor-owned that serves maybe 30 to 40 members per mile line, or a municipal that serves like over 50 members per mile of line. And the line costs the same, as on a per mile basis. So that's why the rural electric co-ops are, it does cost a tremendous amount to run those lines out in the rural areas.
Now, do you share the same lines that, say, Brainerd does? If I know there's a rural co-op in Brainerd, and the city of Brainerd is probably not a member of that co-op, I would guess. But do you serve the same transmission lines? Do you share them, rather?
The same transmission lines are shared. There's a transmission network throughout Minnesota, and it's run by what they call MISO, Midwest Independent System Operators. And so the transmission is different than what the distribution co-ops, or the distribution part of the utility, is owned by that one particular utility, and those lines are not shared. And that is set up in state law.
I kind of made fun of having people confused when we're done here today, but this is really a very confusing issue. I know this evening the Minnesota House, is talking about taking the moratorium off nuclear energy, and I know that this afternoon there was a debate in the federal Congress about taking the cap and trade issue off the table from Obama's proposals. So this whole energy business is very, very complex. Where do you see it going? What do you think's happening?
It's all driven by carbon dioxide. I think it's important to understand that policymakers all want to do the right thing. We want to do the right thing. How you get to doing the right thing, obviously, there's going to be difference of opinion. And there's a body of thought, preponderance of thought, engineered principally by the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that 99% of the CO2 that's produced is man-made. And so, the utilities are of the mind that's probably not the best for the environment to be pumping billions of pounds or billions of tons of CO2 into the atmosphere. the problem in the upper Midwest is we have a high carbon intensity. If you look at us on a national level, for every kilowatt hour we produce, it produces 2.2 pounds of carbon dioxide. And so we are imbued with the original sin of CO2. And so what Washington, D.C. wants to do is put a cap on how much CO2 that can be produced. And each year that cap goes down. It's musical chairs with consequences. Well, you have either one or two options. You can reduce the amount of generation, which would be acceptable, except we're running out of juice. We are literally short on capacity. You can switch to natural gas. Natural gas emits about 50% less carbon dioxide than does coal. But natural gas prices vary, and it can be very expensive. Or you can sequester the carbon dioxide. That technology is not widespread. There's only one entity in the world that is now sequestering carbon dioxide, and that's a gasification plant owned by Basin Electric up in North Dakota. They capture about 50% and use it for enhanced oil recovery. Now, to retrofit an existing power plant with the apparatus necessary to capture CO2 is going to cost about $50 to remove a ton of CO2.
$50 per
megawatt hour, per megawatt hour or a ton of CO2. That is going to drive rates up appreciably. I mean, appreciably. We serve the rural poor. They're already paying higher rates because of our poor demographics. You put a cap on or a CO2 tax, you're looking at rate increases at 24%. That's at $20 a ton. You go up to $50 a ton, which economists have said what the Obama administration proposal on cap and trade is going to be probably 48 to 50% rate increase. And then when you look at the carbon intensity, because of cars and food grown with fertilizer, everything is carbon-based. You're looking at impacts up to $2,100 for low income, under $18,000.
$2,100 a year?
A year. That is
for their electric bill?
For all the impacts associated with carbon dioxide.
Not just the electric
That's
bill.
a 21.4% hit. Now, the upper, the fourth quartile, the upper income, their cost is about $6,000, $6,500. Because they have a greater income, it's a far less percentage, about 6.5%. This is going to fall disproportionately on the rural poor and on low income across the United States, which is why the Obama administration is talking about green stamps. Like food stamps, you get green stamps or amend the tax code. But when you're looking at a huge hit...
What would that mean? What would that do? I mean, what
well, you could get stream stamps to go down to Tadwadena, for example, to pay your electric bill, similar to food stamps. Or you could affect the tax code and forgive, say, the payroll tax. You don't have to pay FICA. There's a number of ways to tinker with the tax code, but then you're looking at a transfer of wealth. And the other pernicious aspect is both coasts have far less carbon intensity than we do in the upper Midwest. We're number 2 in the nation in terms of carbon intensity.
And why is that? Because of the distances that...
No, the issue is because most of our electricity is produced by coal.
About 80%.
80% of the electricity
and that'll go down with renewable mandate, but we use lignite, which is low in some of the pollutants, but it's an overachiever in CO2. And we built the plants way back when because it's cheap fuel, and we pass the savings on to our member owners. We're owned by the members we serve. We're very cost conscious on their behalf.
Mm-hmm. One of the other things that, you know, the capture of CO2 is really a very new or unproven technology. And one of the things that you have to keep in mind is that it's a very power intensive process. If you have a 1,000 megawatt plant, for instance, it might take 25% of the output of that plant just to capture the CO2. So even if we're able to do it, all of a sudden, if we use that technology and it takes that type of power, it'll just speed up the process of when we'll be short of power, and that's coming very soon now.
Well, and I don't think we really have the technology to do that anyway, do we, to capture that carbon?
Number
I mean,
one, the technology is very unproven. There's a pilot plant that's attempting to do that, and there's some very small plants that are attempting to do it, but it's unproven. And number two, if you capture it in huge quantities, what do you do with it? They're talking about injecting it into oil wells and that type of thing. We have no idea if it's going to stay in the ground or if it's eventually going to work its way up or if it becomes dangerous. Don't know.
What is the average cost per month, or how many kilowatts does the average person use in your co-ops? Do you know those figures offhand?
Well, it's about 1,000 kilowatt hours
Would be average?
would be average. And it depends on what part. In Alaska, where energy is 50 cents up to 50 cents kilowatt hour, obviously their
Wow.
usage low. And I think that's part of the environmental lobby is to make electricity from baseload generation so high that it ushers in, like silent power, ushers in other different electric technology that can compete when electricity is way up here. And so that makes wind far more economical, makes solar economical. There's legislation that introduced or being contemplated in the legislature, well-meaning, but would create an artificial market for solar, small solar, that would require Todd Wadeen, again, for illustration, to pay 72 cents kilowatt hour. Well, what that would create is energy arbitrage. They buy it from Todd Wadena for 10 cents, and they sell it back to us for 72 cents. Solar panels are expensive. They, on average, it's about 50 upwards of 72 cents kilowatt hour. The panels are expensive, and the reliability, the amount of time that solar power is going to be available is about 19%. Wind, maybe double that, 38%. So you need standby generation. You need standby generation, either coal-based, which is you're going to need for plug-in hybrids, or you're going to need backup generation fueled by natural gas.
Or storage, which is, as of yet, technically not very feasible.
Which is what this particular
Yep.
company, Silent Power, is working on. So right now we do have this issue of wind farms generating lots of energy, but a lot of the energy is available in the evenings when we don't need it, and so we have no way to store it. So we have these dilemmas with alternative energies, and I know you're not suggesting we don't move to alternative energies, but they all have challenges and they all have cost with them. How much nuclear is generated in Minnesota?
I think Prairie Island is about 1,200. I think we got about 2,000 megawatts, thereabouts. That nuclear energy is relatively cheap because it was built before price escalations. Even though the cost of uranium has gone up, that is a good, solid plant. Produces base load generation, and it has kept rates low. Xcel Energy owns those two plants. We are coal, a little bit of hydro, which is obviously renewable. Renewable from hydro also has fish issues. In the Northwest, you have salmon has been listed as endangered, which adversely affects the flow of the river. And so that's taken an impact. So when you talk about different forms of generation, be it renewable, be it base load, there are issues, adverse issues surrounding it. For example, the United States Congress is anticipating a 15% renewable standard. We have 25% here. If you have 15% and let's say 13% is wind, you can throw up the towers, we have the technology. That would take up the landmass the size of Ohio. This article that I read from a noted economist from Carnegie Mellon says that the turbines, when they spin around, and these go very fast, will create evaporation which would raise global temperature by 1 degree centigrade. Now, of course, what's the offset in terms of carbon they reduce? I don't know the answer to that. So what may be a panacea also purports problems. There is really no silver bullet out there. And so we're trying to come up with silver buckshot to address this in different ways. And conservation is one of those things. The first fuel, and if administered correctly, is one way to reduce the need for new capacity. But by 2030, that's not that far off. At the rate we're going, we have to add 40% more capacity. That's
Nationally.
Nationally, that's a lot of power plants. That's a lot of nuclear plant, which takes about 15 to 20 years to build.
The Environmental Defense Fund estimates there's about 130 million homes in the United States, of which 75% could benefit from energy conservation, more insulation, better windows and doors. I think the stimulus package is going to have some benefits, but from what I've read, it really does not have a huge impact in all of those homes. If you look at the cost, if people are using 1,000 kilowatts today, it's costing $100 and some dollars a month for that. What do you guys think it's going to look like in 2 years for cost? What do you think is going to happen?
We could see significant increases in cost, both from a capacity standpoint and from a standpoint of new taxes, CO2 taxes or cap and trade system. We could see major increases in cost.
What do you mean cap and trade taxes? What is it that's on the table there?
The cap and trade, and I think I'll refer that question to Mark, but the cap and trade wants to cap the amount of CO2 that any company can produce. And if you produce less than that, you have that amount to sell to some other company that produces more CO2, or if it's a new entity that comes in and they need to buy these credits. And they buy those, and it is based on supply and demand. So the cost could get extremely high, or it could be, fairly reasonable. We saw that in the case of sulfur, which produced acid rain. That was a technology that was readily available. It worked. The cap and trade system there worked and worked well. Didn't cost as much as what people had anticipated. But again, as I said, the technology was readily available. They could buy it off the shelf, install it in their plants, and which is different from CO2. There, the technology is not there. It's unproven. It's several years away, if not more. And we're just trying to get that message across to the people that it could become very expensive, and we don't know if it works or not.
I saw that the cap and trade, and as I understand it, means they're trying to find a cap level for our country and to not produce more carbon than that. But it's ironic that in China they're producing 2 power plants a week or every 2 weeks, and their technology is old, and basically that probably will far offset anything that we would do in this country, wouldn't it?
Well, here's the irony. 25 years ago, 2/3 of the Chinese lived in dire poverty, defined by less than $1 a day. Their economy has skyrocketed, and God bless them. Now those 2/3 enjoy a certain amount of prosperity based on, not solely, but based on building two plants a week. Now those plants do not have scrubbers for sulfur dioxide, for nitrogen oxide, for particulates. And so they're spewing that up in the air, and you have haze on the West Coast as a result. Now, their argument is, United States and other developing countries, you created this problem because you've been an industrial nation for so many years. What we want you to do is pay us up to $50 billion a year to put in equipment to reduce CO2. And we want you to prove by 2020 that you have reduced CO2 before we get into the game. So right now we're seeing China has eclipsed the United States in terms of CO2 production. Because their economy has grown to the benefit of the Chinese, they are now buying cars. Cars emit about as much CO2 collectively as power plants. Under the cap and trade, which was envisioned under last year's S2191, this bill picks up agricultural, feedlots, bakeries, hotels, cement plants, anything that produces CO2. Canada was a signatory to the Kyoto Treaty. But instead of seeing their CO2 drop, they started drilling in the oil shale, which releases huge amounts of CO2. They drilled for oil shale because the price of petroleum or oil was at $140 a barrel. That makes sense to drill for that. So a lot of this is pegged to the cost of oil. And oil is starting to creep upward again. You're going to see more drilling for oil shale. In the Dakotas, you've got the Bakken Reservoir, and they're going to tap that because the United States and the world run on energy. This is an exceptionally complex problem. And sometimes I wonder if it defies solution. And so we're all in this together, but by the same token, you have less momentum in developing countries like China, India, because they've seen what energy does for their economy.
We just have a few minutes left, and I know you wanted to talk a little bit about your initiative, Our Energy, Our Future. Could you just touch on that briefly?
Well, thanks for the invitation to do that. We've asked co-op consumers across the nation in Minnesota to talk to their legislators, saying essentially three questions. We're run out of capacity. The last major power plants were built in the 70s, and we're run out of juice. How are we going to build more generation to meet the burgeoning electric load? Second is, what are we going to do about technology? There's technology in vision to capture CO2, but it's not readily or economically available. And thirdly, affordability. Already, up to 30% of co-op customers cannot afford their electric bills, and they're in arrears. And so if you increase rates by 20, 30, 40, 50%, what are we going to do?
Well, we're out of time, and I think we're leaving all of us kind of hanging here, aren't we? So our costs are going to go up, and this is a very complex issue, as we said.
It is.
And stay tuned. But you know that in the next year or two, we're looking at some pretty significant changes, aren't we?
Yes, we are.
Well, thank you for being on the show. You've been watching Lakeland Currents, where we talk about what you're talking about. I'm Ray Gildow. So long until next time.